Mark Reed arrived in a small town in Montana, driving an old pickup truck. He had crossed several miles of dusty road leading from the highway to the outskirts. A former soldier who had served for 6 years, he never expected to return to his childhood home under such grim circumstances. His father died a week ago, and the local authorities reported it as a tragedy blamed on a predator. The official explanation pointed to a coyote, but Mark had already heard that some townspeople doubted this version. He sensed the tension in the air. He stopped at a sign with faded lettering that read, "Reed Ranch," and stepped out of the truck. Fields stretched out along the road, and the rundown fence looked ready to collapse at any moment. The air smelled of dry grass and memories that had haunted him since he received the news of his father's passing. Among the papers delivered by the notary lay a short legal document, a certificate of inheritance. The old house, the land, and the debts all had passed to Mark. The losses had been accumulating for years. He walked through the creaking gate. The barn leaned dangerously, its roof in need of repair, and broken windows let the wind through. Once, the ranch had horses, cattle, and sheep. Now there were only a few rotted boxes and nails sticking out of the walls. As a child, he used to run around the pastures, trying to help with small tasks. Back then, the ranch was thriving. Now only old photographs and a sense that everything had ended long before his father died remained. That same evening, he spoke with a neighbor, Farmer Jack Hollis. Jack drove up in his SUV and offered to help with the paperwork. He mentioned coyotes in a few general phrases and noted that the police had concluded it was an accident. Mark, sensing Jack's hesitation, pressed for details, but Hollis only brought up predators, then changed the subject to debts, giving off the impression he didn't want to dig deeper. His anxious gaze said it all. Mark remembered the letters from his father, received a month before the tragedy. They spoke of financial troubles, a shortage of funds, and stubborn landowners. There was no hint of any life-threatening danger. However, a photo included in the letter caught Mark's eye. In the background behind his father was something strange, and in the corner there were blurry silhouettes resembling four-legged creatures. In the house he found a half-locked door to a storage closet filled with old folders of receipts and bills. Among the papers was a note about a creditor in a neighboring county. The debt was sizable, and the repayment deadlines had long passed. That only reinforced the belief that his father had faced serious problems. Still, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his father's death. Early the next morning, he walked out to the buildings about 200 yards from the house. That was where equipment had once been stored. A metal shed had rusted over, and inside lay scattered metal shards and parts of a broken tractor. Among the tools he found a handsaw, a shovel, and a coil of barbed wire. Remembering the terrible wounds on his father's body, Mark felt his father had encountered something dangerous. Something that went beyond ordinary debts. Later, he headed into town. At the local notary's office, he took care of some paperwork. Talking to people around town, he noticed their cautious approach whenever his father's death came up. One store owner mentioned having seen something strange in the pastures the day before Reed died. Another man, upon hearing that, quickly changed the subject. Mark picked up on the fact that people were afraid to speak openly. By evening, he was back home, sitting in an old armchair. The cracked walls, the smell of dusty wood, and the dim lamplight filled him with gloom. He recalled his military service, where he had learned to act decisively under tough conditions. Now, the atmosphere felt more tense because of the townspeople's silence. It seemed the whole county knew about some threat but avoided discussing it. Before going to bed, Mark decided to check an old dresser in his father's bedroom. In the top drawer, he found a few yellowed photographs taken many years ago. One showed his father standing near the pens with the ranch hands, their faces filled with pride. The date on the back indicated it was during the ranch's prosperous years. The thought of lost time brought him back to the question of his father's strange death. Then he noticed a keychain in the drawer with the initials RR engraved on it. It reminded him of his first horseback riding lessons when his father taught him how to keep his seat. Back then, it felt like they had a whole lifetime ahead of them. Now everything felt different. Mark realized he would have to deal not only with the debts but also with the truth about what had really happened. By dawn, he spotted an old journal on a shelf. Most of its pages were missing, but the cover bore his father's signature. Skimming the surviving entries, Mark found brief mentions of strange night sounds and of an odd creature spotted near the far pasture. In the last lines, his father wrote about dragging debts, someone exerting influence over local farmers, and his intention to approach the authorities. Mark closed the journal, aware that he would have to shed light on a death that wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. He got up before sunrise and immediately headed for the far pastures. He hadn't slept well, plagued by anxiety, and the morning fog clung thick to the grass. He walked slowly, examining the fences and sections of land. Around 300 yards from the house were some low-lying fields where the cattle had always grazed. Approaching, he caught a sharp, unpleasant smell. It reminded him of his days in service, when he'd seen the aftermath of tragedies and the remains of animals on minefields. A moment later, he came upon a gentle slope and noticed a dark shape lying on the ground. As he got closer, he saw it was a cow. The animal was dead and torn apart as if it had been attacked viciously. Deep, ragged wounds covered its neck and flank. Dried blood had formed a dark crust on the grass. Mark realized this was no ordinary coyote attack. The size of the injuries surpassed what any typical local predator could inflict. He knelt down and carefully inspected the edges of the wounds. The flesh was shredded as if by claws, but there were also marks suggesting clean cuts, almost as if made by a blade. He thought of the strange photographs and the neighbors' hints. The idea that some unknown creature was involved frightened him, but his military training told him not to jump to conclusions. He took a mental note of the details: the depth of the wounds, the placement of tooth marks, and the implied strength of the attacker. Then he moved a few feet away, searching for tracks on the damp ground. Within 4 or 5 yards of the carcass, he found something resembling an animal print. The heel and toes were indistinct, and the claws were longer than those of a standard wolf or dog. The track itself was large, more in line with an adult bear, but the shape was different. The lines didn't match anything he had ever seen. He decided to circle around the site of the attack, hoping to gather more clues. On one of the small stakes sticking out of the ground, he spotted a tuft of fur. It was thick and coarse. Wolves typically have a different undercoat texture, and coyotes don't grow fur this long. Mark wrapped the tuft in a clean cloth and slipped it into his pocket. Later, back at the house, he dug out a box of old cameras his father had once used for monitoring livestock. The equipment was outdated, but some devices still worked. After testing a couple of cameras and inserting batteries, he decided to set them up around the pastures. He grabbed a drill, some mounts, and screws. His plan was to attach the cameras to fence posts, aiming them at areas where the livestock usually gathered. He also installed a couple of floodlights with motion sensors. If the mysterious predator returned, maybe it would be caught on camera. It took him about 2 hours to finish. Mark spent time carefully adjusting the camera's angles and hooking up the sensors to a small generator in the corner of the barn. He knew the system was far from perfect, but it was his only chance to gather information. Plus, he hoped the extra lighting would scare off whatever might be lurking around. Toward evening, he sat on the porch and looked out. The silence pressed in on him. There was no wind, no sound, except the occasional clucking of the last couple of hens. At some point, he wondered if he should pack up and leave, sell off the land, and be done with it. But memories of his father and an inexplicable drive to uncover the truth kept him there. As night fell, Mark phoned Jack Hollis to tell him about the dead cow. Jack expressed regret about the loss, but sounded weary. He mentioned that livestock had gone missing around the county before. He didn't offer any details, and Mark could sense that his neighbor was avoiding a frank discussion. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark checked his camera setup. The indicators showed everything was working properly. He armed himself with a shotgun fitted with a flashlight and took up a position near the living room window, which overlooked part of the yard. Hours passed uneventfully. Around midnight he started to drift off, but suddenly a roar echoed in the distance, jolting him awake. The sound came from far off, somewhere north of the pastures. It was powerful enough to be heard from a mile away. A chill ran through him. The tone of the cry didn't resemble a wolf's howl. There were vibrations in it, almost like a growling screech. He immediately grabbed his shotgun and glanced at the monitors. The camera still showed nothing but the quiet landscape. Mark rushed outside, moving along the side of the house. He listened, but the silence had closed in again, as though the night itself was on guard. Not wanting to take any unnecessary risks, he went back inside. Checking the recorded footage, he found no visible source of the roar, though at the exact moment the sound occurred, the video displayed faint interference, like something too elusive for the lens to capture had passed by. He realized he was up against an unknown threat that would be hard to track with standard methods. Guns and spotlights might not guarantee safety. From his military experience, he knew that lacking solid intel put him at a disadvantage. Waiting passively for the next attack seemed foolish, but he had no better plan yet. At dawn, he decided he would scour the area again and review the footage, hoping to find even the slightest clue about whatever was howling and growling in the night. By morning, talk spread in the local diner about a missing boy from a neighboring ranch. Mark went into town for some supplies and overheard whispers among the patrons. Children rarely disappeared in this county, so the news caused immediate alarm. Both adults and teens were now wary of going anywhere alone, especially near the outskirts. Ranch owners were herding livestock closer to their homes for safety. All of this heightened the tension Mark had already sensed since his father's death. While buying ammunition at the local hunting store, Mark was approached by a tall man wearing the sheriff's badge. Mark recognized him right away. Sheriff Ray Holden. He greeted Mark with a polite smile and invited him to step outside so they wouldn't disturb the other customers. Standing on the store's porch, Holden casually asked Mark about the ranch, how his settling in was going. His tone wasn't overtly suspicious, but his politeness felt forced. "I heard you lost a cow recently," Holden said, glancing around the street. Mark nodded and answered succinctly, "Yeah, I saw it myself. The wounds were very strange." The sheriff squinted as if assessing his reaction. Then he brought up the missing boy, mentioning that the whole county was eager to find him, and asked Mark to report anything unusual. Mark promised not to hide anything important. As their conversation wound down, Holden mentioned Mark's father, saying that the elder Reed occasionally spoke of disagreements with certain people he owed money. The sheriff named no names and provided no details, implying only that things could have turned ugly if the debts weren't settled. Mark tried to dig deeper, but the sheriff deftly shifted the topic, insisting he had to keep the investigation unbiased. Mark returned to the ranch feeling uneasy. He had the impression Holden was holding back, even though he was keeping an eye on the situation. But the main concern was the missing child. Mark walked through the house, checked the camera footage. Apart from a couple of times the motion sensors were triggered by a swaying tree branch, there was nothing noteworthy. No hint of the terrifying roar he'd heard the night before. Later that day, during a quick trip back to the town center, Mark noticed the palpable anxiety among the townsfolk. People spoke in hushed tones. Fewer ventured outside at night, and some farmers had already scoured their properties searching for any sign of the missing boy. When Mark questioned them, they offered only vague replies, directing him toward the sheriff for any real details. By the next afternoon, as Mark was strengthening the fence about 15 yards from the barn, the weather stayed dry enough for him to string new barbed wire where the old line had snapped. Suddenly, he heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. It turned out to be an old delivery truck with a company logo. The driver, introducing himself as Tom, handed Mark a package from out of state. The sender was Sam Norris, an old acquaintance of his father who used to work in security systems. Inside the box, Mark found a compact night vision camera and a set of sensors that could be attached to trees. According to the note inside, Norris knew there were some problems at Reed Ranch and wanted to help using his professional connections. Mark decided to install the equipment right away, placing the night vision camera on the far edge of the pasture and mounting the sensors along the path to the tree line where he had previously found bloodstains. This gear was more advanced than what he had, capable of detecting movement at greater distances. That evening, new rumors circulated. The missing boy still hadn't been found. Townspeople were starting to suspect a large predator might have taken him. Some even claimed it might be a lone bear, though grisly activity in that area was unseasonal. Mark revisited the details of the cow's injuries and compared them with his notes. The pattern didn't fit a standard bear attack. Neighbors continued to voice their fear of going out at night, and the small diner near the town center was almost empty after dark. Another day later, Mark stopped by a local shop for groceries. Harry, the silver-haired shopkeeper, quietly confided that a month ago, a farmer on the far side of the county had found nothing but a New's severed head in his field. No one wanted to make it public, fearing it would scare away any tourists. Mark asked if it could be the work of a gang or some criminals, but Harry only shook his head, admitting he had no idea. The fear in his eyes was clear, though he tried to stay composed. That evening, Sheriff Holden showed up at Mark's door looking exhausted. Massaging his neck, he reported that leads on the missing boy were slim. A tracking dog had followed a scent to the edge of the woods, but it disappeared around a creek where they found bizarre footprints. The sheriff asked if Mark had seen anything similar to those tracks. Cautiously, Mark mentioned the prints he'd seen near his dead cow. Holden listened intently and advised Mark not to do anything reckless if that unknown creature reappeared. After the sheriff left, the tension felt even more tangible. That night, Mark saw a few supply trucks drive down the main road. People were stocking up on food, preparing for the possibility of a nighttime curfew. Floodlights blazed at the gas station, and a lone patrol car crawled along the desolate streets. Close to midnight, while reviewing the upgraded surveillance feed, Mark noticed an odd movement on one of the sensors. On the screen, a figure flickered, a shape that looked more human than animal. It darted among the trees at the far edge of the property, then vanished into the woods. Mark waited with his shotgun for several minutes, but whatever it was did not return. Next morning, he made a thorough inspection of the entire ranch. He found no broken fences, no new signs of blood, nothing to prove a large predator had been there. Yet the simple fact that a figure was wandering so close to the pastures set him on edge. It became clear that the local talk of just one creature might be misleading. There could be someone, something, possessing both unusual strength and the ability to move stealthily like a human. Days went by, and the missing boy remained the hottest topic of conversation in the diner and at the gas station. Many residents placed their hopes in the sheriff, while others argued that the community needed help from higher authorities. Mark felt that doing nothing could lead to more disappearances, but he had no concrete proof that would point to any specific suspect. Most of the local farmers still clung to the idea of wolves or bears, unwilling to consider that the threat might be more complicated. By the evening of the third day, the townspeople's unease was evident in how they clung together. The restaurant near the town entrance grew busier at night, as locals believed it safer in a crowd. Sheriff Holden had organized small nighttime patrols, but his staff was limited. Gradually, the hunt for the unknown creature became the main event in the area, disrupting daily life. Mark woke in the middle of the night to the sound of furious barking dogs and a heavy thud against the barn wall. He grabbed the shotgun, slipped a flashlight into his pocket, and rushed outside. Darkness draped the property, with only a faint moonlight piercing the clouds. From the far side of the barn came a new sound, like claws scraping against wood. The dogs barked furiously, trying to advance, but something was keeping them at bay. Mark shone the flashlight through a narrow gap in the barn's boards. He caught a glimpse of a flickering shadow darting about at high speed. He stepped closer to the door, careful not to make a sound. The door creaked open, revealing deep grooves along the wall. The claw marks looked fresh, the edges of the wood still damp. Pieces of splintered board lay scattered on the floor. A sharp odor of wet fur filled his nostrils, suggesting a powerful animal, or some creature infused with wild energy, had been there. Outside, the bushes rustled. Mark swung the flashlight over and spotted a blurred figure slipping toward the fence. He raised the shotgun and fired blindly, hoping to at least hit the spot where it moved. He heard a short moan, like a ragged human exhale. Panic flared inside him. Could he have shot a person? But reason reminded him that no ordinary human would scratch walls and sprint so fast. By the time he reached the bushes, it was gone. Only a few drops of blood remained on the shriveled leaves. The trail led beyond the fence, down a slope toward the woods. Assessing the risk, Mark chose not to follow. Better to wait until daylight to investigate. Come morning, he examined the bushes and found a shallow furrow in the ground, as though something had slid or fallen there, leaving a trail. Drops of blood trailed a few yards farther, then disappeared among the trees. Venturing in a bit deeper, he found nothing but broken branches, no footprints, no flattened grass. It looked as if the wounded creature had vanished instantly. The path ended at a dense thicket. Back at the barn, he inspected the scratches in detail. Their depth exceeded anything a human could do with bare hands. Tufts of fur wedged in the splinters felt coarser than any wolf's coat he'd ever seen. Mark gathered them into a bag, thinking he might show them to a vet or a biologist later. Yet the town was already buzzing with talk about the missing boy and an unknown predator, so he wasn't sure whom to trust. Around midday, Jack Hollis came by to see what had happened. Jack shook his head at the sight of the claw marks and blood. He studied the barn walls briefly, then mentioned that he'd once heard a story about a large hybrid creature roaming the Montana mountains. but didn't know any details. Mark sensed that Jack was trying not to delve too deeply. Hollis's uneasy gaze betrayed fear and disbelief, as though he himself doubted such rumors, but couldn't find any other explanation. That evening, flipping through his father's journal, Mark came upon a short entry. Heard strange rustling at night. Found claw marks by the barn. No one believes me. There was no date, but it fell among pages dealing with debts and ongoing livestock problems. It became clear his father, too, had encountered this unknown creature, and perhaps it was the cause of his death. Before going to bed, Mark took extra care to lock all doors and windows, determined not to leave any way in. He knew even sturdy locks might not stop a powerful attacker, but he wanted at least the illusion of security. He kept the dogs inside, unwilling to risk their lives. He barely slept, convinced that some being lurked out there, something that wasn't entirely human, nor wholly an animal. The next day, Mia, a veterinarian from a neighboring town, arrived without warning. She walked into the yard, intent on examining where the cow had died. Short and energetic, she immediately asked Mark to show her whatever remained of the carcass. When she saw the deep, ragged wounds, she made no hasty guesses but inspected everything with great care. Then they headed to the barn, and Mark pulled out the bag with the clumps of fur he'd collected. Mia held the samples up close, trying to discern their makeup. She said it could belong to a large canid, but the hair structure was atypical. Part of the strands seemed cut by something sharp, though there were also tooth marks. As they stood in the yard, Mia asked cautiously if Mark had heard about any strange experiments or genetic research going on nearby. He replied that he knew of no such thing, though his father had hinted at some problems that might have been related to money or debts. Mia pressed her lips together, as if tempted to say more but held back. She offered to show the fur to specialists she worked with, but warned that official channels might not be enough. While they were talking, they heard a car engine in the distance. Sheriff Holden's vehicle pulled up to the gate. Mia quickly tucked the samples into her bag, signaling Mark to keep quiet. The sheriff emerged and greeted them. Seeing Mia, he asked what brought her out here. She answered that a few local ranchers, whose livestock had been attacked by predators, had asked her to come by. Holden accepted the explanation without probing further, but Mark picked up on the caution in his eyes. The sheriff surveyed the yard and mentioned that another tourist had disappeared recently, with the search turning up nothing so far. He asked Mark to report any suspicious activity around the pastures and noted that neighboring counties were joining the investigation. He shared no direct evidence but mentioned that they'd found deer torn apart in the mountains. Mark realized the danger was likely more widespread than people thought. After Holden left, Mia confided that she had found unusual biological traces in prior livestock attacks. A few months earlier, someone had brought her tissue samples containing cells that showed signs of genetic modifications. According to her, these weren't mere natural anomalies. She was bound by a non-disclosure agreement with a large lab that had requested the tests. Mark had the sense Mia knew more than she was saying. He showed her his father's journal. Certain entries hinted that the elder Reed had been caught up in a conflict going beyond ordinary debts. Mia skimmed the lines describing strange noises at night and inhuman silhouettes along the forest edge. She remarked that Mark's father hadn't believed in the supernatural. He wrote more like a man who suspected some sort of military experiment. Before leaving, Mia asked Mark to call her if anything new happened around the ranch or if there was another attack. She admitted she planned to contact a colleague who specialized in predator genetics. According to her, it was crucial to identify exactly what they were dealing with before jumping to conclusions. Mark thanked her for her willingness to help, but worried their conversation could lead to even bigger problems if the sheriff or his associates caught wind of it. That evening, Mark reviewed the camera footage again. One camera had captured a swift, shadowy form crossing a distant corner of the pasture. Its outline looked like some mix of human and beast. The figure moved on two legs, yet its torso appeared hunched forward. The image quality was poor, but it backed up Mia's suggestion that the creature wasn't a normal animal. It likely possessed both bestial strength and human traits. At midnight, he went outside to check the floodlights, feeling the night hum with tension. The sky was cloaked in clouds, and his small flashlight was the only real source of illumination. In his mind, he braced for another nocturnal intrusion. Everything that had transpired so far made him suspect it wouldn't be long. Knowing Mia had handled cases involving genetic experiments, Mark increasingly doubted that simple predator control could solve his problems. Sheriff Holden arrived first thing in the morning, when the light from the house windows still hadn't fully brightened. He parked his patrol vehicle by the broken fence and spent some time surveying the yard before walking up to the porch. Mark was standing by the door, coffee cup in hand, doing his best to look composed. The sleepless nights, caused by whatever might be lurking outside, offered little chance to truly rest, but he knew how to hide his fatigue. The sheriff greeted him and, settling on the step, pulled a small notepad from his breast pocket. He reminded Mark that a tourist was still missing and glanced toward the barn, where the scars of past attacks remained. Then he asked about the surveillance cameras, if they'd recorded anything unusual overnight. Mark simply replied that there hadn't been any major changes, avoiding details and not mentioning the shadowy silhouette. Holden steered the conversation with leading questions about the mood in town, whether anyone had visited recently, and specifically about Mark's relationship with his late father. It felt like he was trying to piece together his own puzzle. The discussion lasted about half an hour, with the sheriff avoiding any direct mention of the creature, but repeatedly circling back to rumors of missing livestock and sightings of something strange in the woods. Mark sensed Holden was determined to ferret out any information Mark might be withholding. Mark just nodded, offered him water or coffee, which Holden politely declined, and watched as he continued to study the surroundings. Finally, the sheriff stood, brushed the dust from his pants, and said he recommended Mark stay vigilant. He stressed that any information could prove valuable if Mark encountered something out of the ordinary. Then he added that the threat shouldn't be underestimated. Mark walked him to his vehicle, observing the way Holden drove off slowly down the main road. After that, Mark pulled out a small recorder and made some personal notes about the visit. His gut told him the sheriff hadn't come just to check on his safety. He seemed more interested in whatever Mark might have learned during his nightly patrols. That evening, Mark decided to check the cameras around the pastures, but discovered several cut wires. What made it strange was the clean slice, clearly not the work of an animal's teeth. A few mounts had been torn from fence posts, and one camera lay near the fence with a shattered lens. Surveying the area, Mark hoped to find tracks, but he saw only indentations in the damp soil and bits of insulation. This was no accident. Suddenly, shouts erupted from the direction of the stable. Mark dashed over. Thick smoke was pouring from beneath the door, and flames danced inside. The old wooden beams blazed up like kindling. 2 horses and some feed were kept in there. Mark grabbed a bucket, filled it from the water barrel, and tried to douse the doorway. But the smoke intensified. One horse, panicked, managed to break free and bolt outside, while the other was trapped deeper inside. Mark rushed in, covering his mouth with his sleeve, and tried to cut through the rope tying the horse. Heat scorched his skin and stung his eyes, but he managed to sever the knot and push the animal toward the exit. Just then, part of the stable's roof collapsed in the back. Flaming beams knocked into the horse's flank, and it reared away, losing its path to the door. Mark attempted to pull it forward, but the animal staggered, choking on the smoke and flames. Realizing there was no saving it, he had to retreat. Outside, the freed horse galloped around the yard in terror, toppling empty barrels. Mark stumbled out of the burning stable, gasping for air. Turning back, he saw the roof cave in completely, sending sparks and flames shooting high into the night. Dry planks along the walls caught fire instantly, and the remaining hay ignited in a surge of heat. Mark sprinted to the pump and doused the rest of the structure, desperate to keep the blaze from spreading to the house. After several grueling minutes, he managed to contain the fire, but the stable was destroyed. When the smoke cleared, Mark noticed movement at the edge of the property. He grabbed his shotgun and crept closer, only to find a stray dog, spooked by the commotion. No sign of an intruder. Circling the charred building, Mark tried to figure out how it started. There were no obvious traces of an accelerant, but he knew an old structure like this wouldn't just explode into flames so quickly. His military experience told him it could be deliberate sabotage. Once the embers cooled, Mark untied the surviving horse from a nearby post and stroked its neck, trying to calm it. The animal trembled, nostrils flaring in fear. Its anxious neighs echoed through the yard, a sorrowful reminder of the night's devastation. Twilight settled over the smoke, and the first stars flickered in the sky. Mark sank down, leaning against a charred wall, replaying the events in his mind. The last time he'd seen anything like this had been in active duty, where an arson tactic was used to flush the enemy out of hiding. Now a similar pattern was emerging around him. Someone or something was systematically undermining his resources and morale. After a brief rest, he decided to inspect the inner yard. He found that not only were the camera wires cut, but part of the floodlight power supply had been sabotaged. Much of the ranch was now poorly lit. Only a couple of cameras still functioned, though their range of view was limited. Mark gathered the broken gear into a sack, realizing it would take a lot of work to fix. With dawn approaching, he debated whether to drive into town and report everything to the police. But the thought of arguing with Holden, who already seemed determined to pressure him for information, put him off. Besides, he had no solid evidence pointing to any specific person or creature. The one clear fact was that someone was deliberately targeting him. His anxiety spiked. A large predator, if one existed, was unlikely to be slicing wires so neatly, reinforcing the idea that the real threat might be a human intelligence, or at least partly human. And he couldn't help thinking about the missing tourist who might have met the same culprit behind these livestock raids. Sunlight found him kneeling in the ruins of the stable, sifting through ashes for any tools that might have survived. The horse he'd managed to save stood close by, snorting softly. Mark knew the fire had destroyed a big chunk of his supplies, and he'd need new ways to preserve what was left. But his chief concern remained the threat he couldn't simply dismiss as a wild beast. At last he decided more decisive measures were called for. Whoever started the fire might have more plans. Mark gathered his old military gear and mapped out a nighttime patrol route around the pastures and the edge of the woods. He hooked the remaining cameras to backup power units and placed them where they'd be harder to tamper with. He couldn't shake the thought of the blaze. Someone clearly wanted to sabotage him. Yet, he also had to figure out what creature was prowling around, attacking livestock. That first night on patrol, nothing happened. Only the distant yips of coyotes and the rustling trees hinted at danger. Mark moved quietly, careful not to leave tracks on the damp ground. At times, He cut off his flashlight and stood completely still, letting the darkness sharpen his hearing. Silence pressed in, as though warning him that the unknown was still out there. On the second night, he followed the same path but extended his patrol to the far corner of the pasture. A few cattle remained there, not yet herded closer to the house. Suddenly he heard a muffled growl. It seemed to come from an ancient oak about 40 yards from the fence. Mark pressed himself against the trunk of another tree and peeked out. In the moonlight, he saw a tall silhouette. At first glance, it looked human, but something about its proportions was off. Curved shoulders, elongated arms, clawed fingers. The figure moved quietly toward the grazing cows. Mark could hear its strange, heavy breathing, mixed with low, throaty snarls. Raising his shotgun, he peered through the night scope. It was no ordinary large animal, easily over 6 feet tall but moving like a beast. In that instant, the thing sensed his presence. It swiveled its entire torso around, and for a split second, the moonlight illuminated its face. Its features were distorted. The neck was covered in fur, yet the underlying musculature seemed almost human. The eyes glowed with a chilling shine, reflecting a cold intelligence. A tremor ran through Mark, reminiscent of the adrenaline rush he'd felt in combat. The creature let out a short snarl, flexing its claw-tipped fingers. It stopped just a few steps from the fence. Mark decided there was no point in waiting to be attacked. He stepped out from behind the tree, aiming his shotgun. The silhouette hissed, pressed a hand to the ground, and seemed ready to leap. Mark held his stance, aware this thing could vault the fence in one move. An inner voice told him to pull the trigger, but something held him back. There was a cunning rage in those yellow-red eyes. It didn't charge. Instead, it backed away a few steps, as though gauging its opponent. Then came a brief sound, somewhere between a snarl and a strangled cough, and the figure vanished into the darkness, slipping away through the trees. Mark didn't give chase. He stayed where he was until he felt sure the intruder had gone a good distance away. His heart hammered in his chest. What he'd seen defied any stories about wild animals. The creature's behavior was reminiscent of a human, capable of assessing the situation, experiencing anger, yet not leaping into a fight without reason. He flicked the safety on his shotgun and moved toward the nearest cows to check for any attacks. Everything seemed calm. The cattle stood huddled together, visibly uneasy but apparently unharmed. He made it back home before sunrise. Tension hung in the air inside the house. Sitting at the table, he poured himself a glass of water and tried to organize his thoughts. The existence of such a hybrid creature went beyond normal logic, but its eyes had shown a human element. Animals simply didn't look at you with such cold calculation. It felt as though he'd confronted something with both intelligence and fury. Of course, rumors in town persisted about a predator, but no one ever mentioned a humanoid being. Maybe people didn't want to believe it or preferred to avoid the truth. Meanwhile, Mark recalled how Sheriff Holden had asked about the cameras and had taken notes. The impression lingered that the sheriff himself knew far more than he let on. Before going to sleep, Mark jotted down notes in his observation journal. Height, the shape of the claws, body proportions, and how the creature behaved upon contact. He described its facial features: short fur on the cheeks and forehead, an elongated muzzle with wolf-like teeth, yet a skull structure partly reminiscent of a human. After that, he turned out the light and fell asleep, still gripping his shotgun tightly. The next day, he spoke with Mia by phone. She wanted to come examine the tracks in person but was called away on urgent business in a neighboring county. Mark told her about the encounter in the pasture. He mentioned that, despite the opportunity, the creature had not attacked. Mia didn't draw any concrete conclusions, but noted that such behavior could be seen in cases where a predator's genes were mixed with human DNA. There was a subdued alarm in her voice. She promised to visit as soon as she could to take a closer look at the scene. Later, Mark headed out to the yard to reinforce the fence with metal rods salvaged from old equipment. He was distracted, torn between two trains of thought. The first was that he must shoot the monster if it appeared again. After all, it had already torn apart livestock and possibly even people. The second was that the creature had refrained from attacking that night, suggesting it had its own reasons for holding back. Such behavior was nothing like mindless hunting. The idea that he might be dealing with a creature possessing not just animal instincts, but a calculating intelligence weighed on him even more. That evening, he reviewed the footage from the remaining cameras and found several clips showing a blurry figure running. Though the video quality was poor, the motions confirmed what he'd seen at the pasture. When the creature moved, its hands seemed unnaturally long, and each stride was larger than a human's. At times it would straighten its upper body, as though standing on two legs, and in the next moment, it could drop to all fours. Mark documented these details in a separate notebook to discuss with Mia later. That night, he went on patrol once more. Sticking to the edge of the field, he tried to stay silent. He heard the distant cries of small nocturnal animals, but saw no sign of that mysterious figure. Convinced the creature wouldn't appear, he headed back to the house. Yet as he approached the yard, he sensed something behind him. Spinning around, he only managed to glimpse a tall shape passing through the moonlight. Soft footsteps faded into the undergrowth. Mark realized the creature hadn't gone far at all. It might have been watching him. Late in the evening, Mia arrived in her pickup, pulling up to the porch with the headlights off. Darkness had already fallen, and only a weak outdoor lamp lit her silhouette. Mark went out to greet her, noticing the strain in her expression. She said she had just come from the outskirts of another ranch, where they'd found yet another carcass displaying strange wounds. She had taken samples for analysis and already run them through a colleague with genetic expertise. Even Mia was shocked by the results. The samples showed cellular structures containing human genes spliced with fragments unrecognized by standard databases. She spoke quietly, as if afraid someone might be eavesdropping. The documents she had managed to glance at hinted at unregistered experiments, yet no official source confirmed that such research could be underway in Montana. She stressed that in having the samples tested, she'd already broken a non-disclosure agreement, so she couldn't publicize everything she'd learned. Mark listened intently, realizing that the presence of human genes explained the creature's cunning and its odd way of backing off. The mention of unknown genetic material suggested this hybrid was no product of normal nature. A tense realization surfaced. Maybe Mark's father had learned about these experiments. Perhaps he'd intended to go to the authorities or the press and wound up dead under suspicious circumstances. Mia's findings implied that his father's demise could indeed be tied to a leak of information. They sat down in the kitchen, and Mia began recounting how she'd previously come across anomalous tissue samples and been ordered to hand them over to a certain clandestine organization. She never knew exactly who was behind it. She just got paid through intermediaries and signed documents forbidding her to disclose details. Since then, she'd suspected that, in some remote area, dangerous research involving genetic modification had been carried out. Judging by the current data, it hadn't ended. Rather, it had spiraled out of control. Mark took a piece of paper from the table and showed Mia his own notes describing the encounter with the creature by the pasture. She read every word, clarifying the details of the hybrid's behavior. Based on the livestock injuries and the unique cell samples, she noted the possibility that this creature might not be alone. However, there was no direct proof of multiple beings. She advised Mark to do all he could to protect himself and anyone else who might be at risk of an attack. Their conversation was cut short by a sudden loud noise from deep in the yard. Mia and Mark rushed to the window and caught sight of a shadow rushing along the fence. Mark grabbed his shotgun and flashlight and dashed outside, but the figure had already vanished into the dark. The floodlights illuminated only a small area, and there was nothing to see. Mia stood on edge beside him, asking if he should call for backup. Mark said Sheriff Holden wouldn't show up at a moment's notice anyway, and additional people without the right training might only complicate matters. Mia revealed the test results stored on a flash drive. The graphs and figures confirmed a complex mutation scenario. Mark realized that this data could be key to discovering the truth. But Mia warned that if they made such information public, they themselves might be accused of illegal research methods. Plus, there was no guarantee the authorities or the labs wouldn't try to destroy the evidence, as had happened before. The look in her eyes made it clear that both of them were putting themselves at risk by getting involved. Wrapping up her visit, Mia said she'd need to drive to another town soon for medication and special animal treatments related to these nighttime attacks. Several farmers had reached out to her about losing livestock as well. She urged Mark to call if anything new happened and handed him a kit for collecting biological samples on his own, so he wouldn't have to rely solely on her visits. Late that night, Mark was alone again. He plugged the flash drive into his old laptop and looked over the lines of genetic code, recalling his father's journal entries about strange incidents and groups of people arriving in the mountains with expensive gear. No one had taken him seriously at the time. Now it all made sense. Those groups could have been tied to the experiments that led to this hybrid. Mark understood his father had gotten caught in a deadly game, paying with his life for trying to expose it. He knew he couldn't keep acting blindly. The creature had the strength of a beast and the mind of a human. And now a conspiracy was coming to light all around him. He decided to set a trap, to confront the monster under carefully controlled conditions for the first time. He analyzed the ranch layout and chose a spot to gather the remaining cattle under good lighting. The plan was simple: force the hybrid to step into the light, record its behavior, possibly wound it, and if the chance arose, eliminate the threat. He spent the day getting ready. Using portable floodlights, he created a circle of illumination in the main pasture, where he'd set up a temporary enclosure for a few cows. Along the perimeter, he placed heat sensors connected to an alarm system, hoping it would alert him to the creature's approach before it attacked. In the center, he arranged a few containers of leftover feed to attract a potential predator. Night came, clouds blanketed the sky, and the wind swept across the field carrying the scent of damp grass. Mark positioned himself behind a small makeshift shelter once used to store hay bales. He wore a protective vest and had a rifle with a scope. A small device linked to the sensors lay on a rough wooden bench next to him. Each time it detected movement at the edge of the field, it let out a faint signal. About 100 yards behind him, closer to the house, 2 dogs stood watch on long leashes, ready to pick up any foreign scent. For several hours, nothing disturbed the peace. The cows occasionally shifted their weight and glanced at the glow of the floodlights. Mark was starting to think the night would pass uneventfully. Then the device gave a short beep. A barely audible tone sounded in the earpiece Mark wore. He steadied his rifle and focused on the circle of light. He saw nothing, but the sensors indicated a heat source beyond the lit area. Minutes passed, heavy with tension, until a vague figure appeared in the floodlights, moving along the pasture's edge. Mark froze, fighting the tremor in his hands. The shape slipped soundlessly across the grass, crouching as if wary of the bright light. A second later, something dashed fully into the lit zone. A snarling growl echoed, and it was clear the creature had decided to approach the enclosure after all. Mark slowly rose to one knee, aiming for a warning shot. He wanted to scare it off, yet realized this might be his best chance to catch his opponent off guard. Just then, someone let out a pained moan. Emerging from behind the bushes, not far from the hiding spot, was Sheriff Holden. He walked unsteadily, clutching his left side where his uniform was ripped. Mark was certain Holden's appearance here couldn't be random. The sheriff looked exhausted, as though battling unbearable pain. Sweat glistened on his face, and the floodlights cast an odd glare in his eyes. "Mark," he said weakly, gasping for breath. Don't shoot." Mark lowered the rifle, utterly bewildered. At that moment, movement flared at the far edge of the field. The beast Mark had intended to trap had come near the enclosure but now spotted both Holden and Mark. A savage roar erupted and the shape crouched, ready to leap. Mark raised the rifle again, but everything went sideways. Holden moaned and then began to change. His muscles quivered violently, arms twisting at an unnatural angle, and the uniform shredded across his shoulders. Tears formed in the fabric, revealing scarred skin that pulsed strangely. Mark realized in dawning horror that Holden was transforming before his eyes, and it looked agonizing. The sheriff's features morphed into something bestial, his face losing its human outline. His eyes glowed with a familiar predatory gleam. Wolf-like fangs burst through his gums, and claws elongated from his fingertips, tearing what was left of his gloves. In a matter of moments, another were-creature stood before Mark, clearly more powerful than the one he'd glimpsed in the field. Its roar merged with the other beast's snarl echoing across the pasture. It turned out that the creature Mark was trying to capture had also advanced into view, only to face Holden, who had lost all traces of his humanity. Holden lunged forward, shaking with spasms, striking at the other beast with a single swipe, driving it away from the cows. It seemed these two anomalies recognized each other as enemies or competitors. Their fight broke out in a flurry of ferocity. At first, Mark could only watch in shock, struggling to accept that Sheriff Holden himself was one of the mutated beings. He remembered his father's journal mentioning a man in uniform tied to illegal experiments. Apparently, Holden had become an unwilling participant and concealed his condition behind the badge. The tear in his uniform kept growing, revealing swelling muscles and coarse fur. His snarls were a blend of pain and rage. At one point, the beast from the field sprang at Holden, and they tumbled across the ground. Mark aimed his rifle but couldn't decide whom to target. Both were dangerous. The scene was like a clash of monsters where there was no longer any place for a mere man. Holden managed to bury his claws in his opponent's side, and the creature let out a piercing wail, springing away. Though smaller than Holden, it moved faster. Mark sensed both were driven by something beyond normal reasoning. Finally, the beast Holden had wounded retreated into the darkness beyond the floodlights, snarling as it disappeared. In that instant, the sheriff turned toward Mark, his eyes ablaze with a red fury. He staggered a few steps closer, speaking in a voice that was half human, half growl. The words were unclear, but Mark caught the faint impression of a plea. A mix of madness and dim human awareness flickered in the sheriff's expression. Holden seemed at the brink of his endurance, his body literally tearing itself apart from the mutation. A moment later, he dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. Mark glanced around, trying to locate the other beast. It was gone, leaving a trail of blood. Apparently it had been wounded in the fight. Only Holden remained trembling on the ground. He looked at Mark with eyes full of rage and pain, laced with a desperate, pleading humanity. He tried to speak, but only managed strangled sounds. Mark inched closer, gripping his rifle, unsure whether to finish off the former sheriff or attempt to help him. A single bullet might have released him from his torment, but that decision felt unbearable. Holden knelt, trying to curl in on himself to manage the pain. His beastly features shifted from moment to moment, 1 second reverting slightly toward human form, the next twisting into a snarling muzzle. Mark cautiously approached, keeping his rifle at the ready. Holden lifted his gaze, revealing a mix of fear, willpower, and grim acceptance. He made a tiny motion with his clawed hand as though to get Mark's attention and rasped a few words. Mark leaned in. Holden was trying to say he needed to be killed. Otherwise, he would become fully consumed by the mutation, losing all control. Worse, the virus or genetic changes could find a new host if his body remained intact. Mark didn't grasp all the specifics, but it made sense that this dark power could spread further. Sheriff Holden drew a harsh breath and pleaded for a favor. He knew a simple bullet would put him in the grave, but if his body wasn't destroyed completely, there was a risk the mutation could survive. He begged Mark to burn him after the shot. Mark hesitated, but saw there was no hope for Holden to return to normal life. The sheriff's shoulders shook in spasms, blood seeping through the torn uniform. There was no denying he remained a lethal threat as long as he drew breath. Taking a deep breath, Mark aimed for Holden's heart and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed across the darkened pasture, and the sheriff's body jerked, then slumped. A ragged moan escaped his throat, followed by silence. Mark stood there for a few seconds, unmoving. He knew this decision carried a heavy weight, but there had been no other choice. He retrieved a gas can from his truck and dragged Holden's body to a spot free of dry grass. He doused the uniform and fur with the fuel, then flicked open his lighter. His hand shook as the flame touched the gasoline. A blaze roared up, sparks shooting into the night. Fire consumed Holden's remains, filling the air with the stench of burning flesh. Mark turned away, trying not to dwell on the sight. He understood that the sheriff might not have been the only one suffering from the mutation. When it was over, Mark backed up a few steps, struggling to steady his breathing. His head spun, his heart pounding in his ears. The knowledge that Holden himself had pleaded to prevent the infection from spreading didn't do much to ease the guilt. And there was a new worry. The other creature had escaped, injured and bleeding. If contact with its blood could transmit the mutation, the danger was far from over. Mark glanced at his left arm. He felt a sting near his elbow. During all the chaos, he'd gotten a minor cut while ducking behind cover, and now it throbbed. Blood trickled down his skin. Waves of pain spread in a way that felt odd for such a small wound. He ran his hand over it and sensed heat radiating along his veins, a feverish weakness, as though some unknown illness was setting in. He realized that burning Holden's body might not be enough to halt the infection entirely. In the fight, they had stood close, and droplets of blood could have landed on his clothes. Staring at his own wound, he felt a terrible suspicion creeping in, that he himself might be infected. A drawn-out roar echoed outside. It sounded like it came from the forest, a haunting reminder that the other beast was still roaming nearby. At dawn, Mark stepped into the house and looked in the mirror. His pupils seemed slightly dilated. Switching on the light, he squinted at the glare, noticing his eyes were reacting differently now. A film of sweat coated his forehead, and his skin felt hot to the touch. Perhaps the mutation had found its way into his bloodstream. The thought weighed on him heavily. All was quiet outside. Only the distant sounds of morning's first stirrings reached his ears.